Good afternoon, Patriots. This is the American Vision, broadcast on the TLBTV network and brought to you by the Liberty Beacon Project. I'm your host, Bill Muckler, and I'm coming to you from my home studio in Cocoa, Florida, on America's beautiful Space Coast. And today I've got a very special guest. I'm really honored to have someone coming to us from Hawaii, actually, the island of Oahu, and that's Fred Galvin. And Fred and I have a lot in common, both Missouri University graduates from a couple of different schools, though, and also officers in the Marine Corps. So, Fred, welcome to the show, and I'm just really honored to have you with us.
Hello, Bill. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about you grew up in Kansas City and joined the Marine Corps at an early age.
Yes, I grew up in Kansas City on the south side of the city where it was a very rural, and I spent most of my youth playing outdoors, which was just rivers and fields. Had a lot of howls and coyotes. It was undeveloped at that time, and a really beautiful, safe place to be in back in the 70s. And then my family took, at an early age, we had a trip that went to the East Coast, and I discovered a lot about American history. We did a battlefield tour of many of the Civil and Revolutionary War battlefields that took us to Valley Forge, the historic Triangle in Southern Virginia. And it was in many of those battlefields where myself as a 10-year-old boy, I learned, and I was in shock and awe that there was Americans that felt so strongly about freedom, from the British, and freedom, for all people, that they took arms and they fought. And so many of them, these battlefield tours, led by the tour guides, were so vivid. They stood in my head as a 10-year-old boy. I wanted to serve my country, and I didn't know how. Didn't have anybody in the family that served in the military, but that led me all the way through growing up. And I played a lot of sports in high school. And I went to a Jesuit preparatory school, Rockhurst High School in Kansas City, that I didn't know which branch of the service. I just knew I wanted to, I was going to serve, and I made my mind up since I was 10. So at 17 years old, a week after graduating high school, I joined the Marine Corps, went to boot camp.
Where'd you go to boot camp? Did you go to San Diego?
Yes. So everybody that's west of the Mississippi, the male Marines, they go to San Diego, and everybody east of the Mississippi, and then all female Marines, they go to Parris Island, South Carolina. So that was another remarkable change, because that was the first time being from the prairies of Kansas. You see a flat, you don't see the ocean, and then you get out there and you see, like, wow, they have tall skyscrapers in the city of San Diego, ocean and mountains. It was beautiful. And I ended up spending 12 of the years that I served out in Camp Pendleton, California. It was beautiful.
Mm-hmm. So you went through boot camp, and then you were assigned. I know one of the units you were assigned to was the 4th Marine Regiment. But where were some of the places you were stationed at?
Okay. Well, I did go to boot camp in San Diego, and then I served. My first tour, we deployed to Desert Shield and Desert Storm on the USS Tarawa with Regimental Landing Team 5. We went into Kuwait, and a lot of people say it is what it is, but sad thing, that's the last war or conflict that America had a decisive victory, and that should be studied a little bit more, in my opinion, and be viewed as, when we are united together as America and a coalition, how we can fight and win wars. After that, I returned to California, where I was stationed at Camp Pendleton, and went to college in the reserve program. I studied at California State University at San Marcos, and graduated with a degree in history and a degree in social science. And then I worked, ironically, as a stockbroker for 2 years. I started out in San Diego, and then I moved back to Kansas City and worked as a stockbroker at Smith Barney. And I knew in my early 20s, I have to, I really wanted to serve again in the military and the Marine Corps. And at that age, I was like, I have to make a decision. And I returned, I actually tried to get back in as an enlisted Marine as a sergeant. However, in the Clinton administration, they were downsizing personnel, and they did not allow me to re-enter the Marine Corps as an enlisted Marine. But I had a college degree and a good track record, so they took my application as an officer, and was allowed to go to officer candidate school, and I became an infantry officer. Went back out to Camp Pendleton, California, which is where I enjoyed it, and served with a light armored reconnaissance unit there in Camp Pendleton again. And then we did a deployment, which we thought in 1998 they were kicking the NATO weapons inspectors out of Iraq. We thought this was going to be Desert Storm 2, which it kind of dissolved. And then, so we returned from that deployment after 6 months on ship. We trained with some different countries in the Middle East, and then we returned home. I accepted orders to Okinawa, Japan, do a 5th Force Reconnaissance, which was a unit that was stationed in Okinawa, Japan, and has now been redesignated as 3rd Recon Battalion. From that point, I served the majority of my career in force reconnaissance. I did do a stint as an instructor after leaving Okinawa, after my first assignment there for 3 years, where we traveled across the Pacific and did all this incredible training, jumping out of planes and diving and doing close quarter battle and taking down ships. But I went out to Yuma, Arizona, stationed as an instructor with the Marine Aviation Weapons and Tactics Squadron 1, which is the Marine Corps' version of the Navy's Top Gun or the Air Force's Red Flag. And I had was stationed there for 15 months, and the war began to break out in Iraq. At that point, I returned again to Camp Pendleton. You see a recurring trend here. And I was served as a platoon commander, this time with 1st Force Reconnaissance Company. And this was in 2002 through 2006. And we were getting ready, and then it was the beginning and through the height of the insurgency in Iraq. And we did multiple workups and deployments to Iraq as a platoon commander until I was promoted to the rank of major. And that's coincided with the startup of the Marine Special Operations Command, which is where they pulled me from Camp Pendleton, California on the West Coast, and sent me to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. And I was the first commanding officer of the Marine Special Operations Task Force. We went into Afghanistan. It was highly politicized at that location along the Pakistan and Afghanistan border. And we did get into an ambush where we were falsely accused of murder. And that's been heavily covered in the press, and I can talk about that more in depth.
Yeah, and we can, before we get into that, when I was on active duty, we had recon platoons and companies, but now the Marine Corps has what's force recon, and I don't even know if I understand it fully, but I think a lot of our viewers are not going to be familiar at all, but is force recon pretty much the Marine Corps Special Operations units?
Yes, so the Marine Corps has many elite units. I know that in the Marine Corps it's taboo to say there's an elite within an elite, but they have units that do have specialized skills and training, and such as FAST, and that's, I actually retired out of Fleet Anti-Terrorism Security Teams as their commanding officer, and then they have reconnaissance, and each Marine Infantry Division, they have a reconnaissance battalion, and then they have force reconnaissance, which those are volunteers. They're not actually forced to do anything, but they support the Marine Expeditionary Force, which is a 3-star commanding general, 3-star Marine general. And then now they have, at the designation from former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld in 2005, the Marines subsequently activated in 2006 a Marine component to the United States Special Operations Command that's based down in Tampa, Florida. And that command has their own components in every branch of the service: Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines. Marines got started in 2006, like I mentioned. And so those Marine Special Operations Command, Special Operations Trained personnel are now called Raiders, just like the World War II Raiders. And they do deploy all over the globe. They've conducted over 300 deployments in the last 13 years. So they're like the Marine Corps hymn, every climbing place where they can take a gun, they've been pretty much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So a lot of people don't understand that, and I know when I was in the Marine Corps, it was almost no one wanted to say there was anybody elite, because all Marine units and all Marines are elite, and we really believe that. But then we do have some that have special training and are assigned to special operations groups.
Yes. Actually, in World War II, when they created the Raiders, that was a presidential decision from Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he looked at what Winston Churchill was doing with the British Royal Marines, and he created a commando unit from the British Royal Marines to go behind enemy lines in Germany and wreak havoc. Roosevelt wanted that. He created it in 1942, and the Marine Corps was so adverse to it that 2 years later, while in combat, the Marine Raider Regiment was transitioned and returned back to mainly the 4th Marine Regiment. And so General Vandergrift, who was the commandant of the Marine Corps at the time, once he became the commandant, he signed over in February 1944 that it is not in the best interest of the Marine Corps to have an elite within an elite. And they unfortunately were disbanded, and the Marine Corps never had a good the U.S. Special Operations Command began in 1987. The Marine Corps resisted and opposed for 25 years, said no. And then Dr. Rumsfeld, who had been Secretary of Defense right after Vietnam, and again for President Bush at the beginning of the Iraq War, he directed the Marine Corps, you're going to stand this up. So the Marine Corps basically got forced. And so you could compare it kind of to an arranged marriage. The Godfather, Dr. Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense, had the Special Operations Command and Headquarters Marine Corps, and they birthed this child, which was our task force. So that's how it came to be.
So this brings you to what I interrupted you on in March of 2007. When you were in Afghanistan, you were a major. Tell us what happened, and then if you want to, tell us all about how this all came about and how you got. I'm not sure if I know exact words to use, but somehow you and your Marines were accused of murdering civilians, when everything I've read shows that was the farthest thing from the truth.
Yes. Very interesting. So we did the very initial deployment for the Marine Special Operations Command, and we were asking the 11 months prior to our deployment every week where we were going to go, what type of missions we would do. We didn't find out until we actually had boots on the ground in Afghanistan that this is where we're going to go. And that is something that is kind of the Marine Corps being a general purpose force that largely deploys upon ships and is trained to be worldwide deployable. That's acceptable when you have a ship full of gear and you have units that can reinforce and support. But when you're a company of basically warriors alone, and you don't have the logistics tail, and you don't have vehicles and all this different variety of gear and equipment tailored to go all these different environments around the globe, from jungle to Arctic. We were told you would likely probably go to Eastern Africa, the Horn of Africa. And, I'm just a guy from Kansas City, so I thought during a run-up into the general elections for presidency, I do not think that we're going to start a war in a third location. And we were fighting at that time Iraq and Afghanistan. And one thing, not to get off on a rabbit's trail, but in 2007, it was very much similar to what we're looking at here in 2009. It was the 2 years prior to an election, and There were things that were going on that, there was a full-length ad in the New York Times that said General betray us. And the Iraq War, General Petraeus at the time he'd recommended and was approved to have a surge. And there was a lot of Democratic leaders that were protesting that, saying, there's hundreds of Americans that are being killed each year. We're surging over 100,000 American forces in there. It was bitterly opposed. People are saying, Bush lied getting us into Iraq. And I didn't realize as a young kid, from Kansas City that, 20 years later, I'm in Afghanistan, that we could be a pawn. And unfortunately, there was a congressman from Pennsylvania named Congressman Jack Murtha, who made some regrettable statements. He served in the Marine Corps in Vietnam, and he said that these Marines killed these innocent Iraqi civilians in cold blood, speaking of an infantry case that had gone on in Haditha, Iraq. And those Marines were basically hung out to dry when a congressman, one of the longest serving congressmen, who had been a Marine combat veteran, when he makes a statement like that during a criminal investigation, we started to see a lot of these starting to get very unpopular. There's several of these war crimes cases, from Hamdaniya to Haditha. And then in our case in Afghanistan, that started to be something that especially the left really started to tout, that look at all the stuff that the GOP started these wars, and now we've got Marines killing civilians in Iraq and Afghanistan. It kind of led to a situation when we were on that mission in Iraq and Afghanistan in 2007. We were going into this village to do this meet and greet with tribal elders. And unfortunately, this is how, misguided some of this philosophy of winning hearts and minds and the counterinsurgency that I'll go on the record, Bill, and say it's been an absolute failure. After 18 years, these forever wars that, the leaders in charge, they should have every one of their children. If they think this is a successful strategy, every one of their children should be over there fighting. And if they think it's successful, we're entering our 18th year in Afghanistan. Send your wife and daughters to a bed and breakfast in Bagram and really put your skin in the game and money where your mouth is if you think this is effective. But so we had to go in. We're going in this village to do a meet and greet, because you had to have pretty much a federal case developed to prosecute any kind of bad guys, even though we had intelligence, we knew they were bad. So on our way into this village, we got blown up by a car bomb. It was a van that detonated at the lead echelon of our platoon. Then we started getting shot at from the left side of the road by jihadists that were speeding at us in a van, or a sports utility vehicle. The jihadists hanging out the side, shooting AK-47s fully automatic at us and trying to finish us off. And then we shot and killed them. Then we started receiving fire from the right side, to include sniper fire. And these were dismounted personnel that were bounding using military tactics. This happened, Bill, at 9 o'clock in the morning, broad daylight. There was people try to say that there's a fog of war. This is not a jungle in Vietnam. This was a flat desert area along the highway along the Afghan-Pakistan border at 9 o'clock in the morning. As we entered that town, there was just military-aged men lined up on the side of the road staring at us, looking for a fight. And then they brought it to us. So this was not something that people say that there was a snap fog of war. But afterwards, and we stayed there in that kill zone for 5 minutes, killing the people who were shooting at us, and nothing but, the vehicle that was heading towards us, it was down a dirt road that there was nothing behind, and the people on the opposite side were in a riverbed with nothing behind. So people, the armchair quarterbacks that, were making comments in the press said, some civilians had to have been killed. And, I was an eyewitness there. I took a polygraph, showed that no deception was indicated, that no civilians killed. We stayed there in the kill zone, like I said, for 5 minutes stationary. We sent reports back to our higher headquarters. There was no mixing up the stories. Those reports were immediately received over the radio by myself and a captain that I was in charge of, who was on the patrol as well.
Mm-hmm.
But then, we made the decision that it's not smart to hang out in an area that we just had a battle with, to drink tea with the tribal elders, like the counterinsurgency philosophy urged, win their hearts and minds. So after we killed the enemy that were fighting us, we moved out and we started to again receive fire again, for this time from the right side of the road. We had a massive mob form on the road they pulled a vehicle trying to block us in that kill zone. And that mob moved towards us, trying to cinch us in that kill zone. We fired above their heads, and then that opened the Red Sea, and we were able to get around that vehicle and return back to our base, which is where we saw the reports in the media just explode, that we killed large numbers of women and children in this village. And that number continued to grow and grow. And then there was protests and riots, and the president of Afghanistan condemned us in the press and urged the military leaders who didn't take any stand, and they kicked us out of the country. And this, of course, for the Marine Corps was very embarrassing. The very first unit in Marine Corps' proud history and tradition to ever be kicked out of a war zone. So we were sent out of the country, and 7 of us were the subject of a criminal investigation where they were seeking to convict us of homicide, which on the books, the max punishment is death. And we were looking at probably spending the rest of our lives in Leavenworth Disciplinary Barracks as a permanent residence. And but we went to a court in 2008 in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, 3.5 weeks long, the longest courtroom trial in Marine Corps history. And we, at the end of that, as you know from your time in the Marine Corps, Bill,
mm-hmm.
any military justice case ends in 3: either you're innocent, you're guilty, or it's dismissed.
Mm-hmm.
In our case, they used the phrase that we had acted appropriately, which is not a legal term, and it allowed the press to just run wild from when they made that decision in May of 2008, which was four whole months after the trial. 4 months after the trial had ended, that gun battle was a gun battle. There's nothing classified about it. It lasted 5 minutes, but they spent 3.5 weeks in the courtroom and took 4 months to figure out how to spin this thing.
Mm-hmm. And
they released it on a Friday night news dump over Memorial Day weekend. And that's for those who are listening that are not, having themselves or their families serve in the military. There's very few holidays that the Pentagon actually goes down to a skeleton staff and gives people more than just the weekend off. So they released this on what we call a 4-day liberty period, where we, 96 hours of over Memorial Day weekend, basically everybody except for a skeleton crew that's in the command center get the day off. So 4 days later, this isn't even big news, and they just had used those terms that we had acted appropriately according to the rules of engagement and tactics, techniques, and procedure for a complex ambush. So they admitted that we were in a complex ambush, but it left the ambiguity in the press's mind. By them, the press was assuming that, hey, they didn't say they were innocent. They never used the phrase not guilty. So from that time in May of 2007 until I retired in April 2014, the press had just continually written. And Bill, they even wrote on the day I retired that, this article in the Military Times that we killed 19 and wounded 50 innocent Afghan civilians. And then I spoke at that time I was retired, so I wasn't under the Title 10 U.S. Code. I had my First Amendment rights back, and contacted the managing editor-in-chief of the Military Times, and all he did was change the words from they killed 19 to they killed up to 19 civilians and wounded 50 civilians. So I was trying to move on with my life. I moved back to Kansas City. I was taking care of her sister, who was a University of Missouri Columbia graduate, and she was fighting cancer, and I started a business in school at the University of Missouri Kansas City, and then trying to move on with my life. That year, 6 months later, on November 10th, of 2014, which is the Marine Corps' birthday, and it's basically a high holy day in the Marine Corps. They wrote another article in the Military Times, again slamming us and using that phrase, they killed up to 19. So at that point, Bill, I was like, I got to go on offense and set the record straight. And like you had mentioned, you read about this now, there's been several stories that we have aggressively fought to set the record straight so that our men don't walk around and have that permanent, black mark that the public thinks that we killed civilians and got away with it, because that's what the media was perpetuating. And the Marine Corps had not set they never used definitive legal terms. So that was just really preventing us, even after I graduated with my MBA, we were not able to get jobs. And when you have your face and name in the paper, stuff like that, it was really adversarial. So, but now this last month, they had released a 12-page report from the Department of the Navy that really set the record straight about how that investigation was conducted. They used very strong, definitive, clear terms, such as it was either gross negligence or it had a predetermined outcome. And it just really showed that that was a biased and partial, influenced investigation, and it should not have proceeded that way. So I'm glad that even though the Marine Corps did not handle this properly, but the Department of the Navy's senior civilians showed that courage and set the record straight very, very clearly in that 12-page final report that was released last month.
Yeah, released in January of 2019, just a month ago. When the people see this, it'll probably be about 2 months. So then you're back in Hawaii now, and you're working for the Marine Corps. What are you doing with the Marine Corps now?
Okay, so I'm involved in the Marine Corps at the Marine Corps Pacific headquarters here in Camp Smith, Hawaii, dealing with posturing Marines at various locations across the Pacific to deal with, ensure that we can properly balance, Marine Corps forces with different threats that exist or will likely in the future exist, so that we can respond to any crises around the Pacific theater.
So are you a military contractor, or are you on active duty?
No, I'm a government civilian, a GS employee, so it's a full-time permanent position. And I've asked in the Marine Corps last year when they were doing this investigation on my background to see if what had happened was right or wrong, and they had let me know last September, hey, we can't tell you the outcome, but we will say that it was unanimous. And I had told my attorney who told me that, because he wasn't my attorney, nor myself were even allowed in this investigation, but he had a government prosecutor and a government defender that basically examined this whole thing without any personal appearance being authorized. So it led to, when I received that information that it was unanimous, I didn't know one way or another. I had asked if they would allow me to, if it was positive, and they would remove that adverse material from my official military personnel file, that they would, because I was forced. Marine Corps is an up or out organization, so if you don't get promoted at certain year time frames, you have to leave. And so I was forced to retire in 2014 because I didn't get promoted to lieutenant colonel. And so I've asked that they look at, now my promotion to lieutenant colonel, and if they would also allow me to be reinstated back on active duty as a Marine officer. And so those things are both in the works right now. So possibly by the time this is aired, we may have further information on my promotion and being allowed to go back on active duty or not.
That would be fantastic. Do they still use the terminology passed over?
Yes.
So you were passed over for a lieutenant colonel because of this incident, which to me is a political incident more than anything else.
It was.
And let's hope we can keep politics the Marine Corps and the rest of the armed services. Fred, it's been such an honor to have you on the show, and I have so much respect and admiration for you and what you did. You were in the Marine Corps on active duty for what, close to 25 years?
Yes, I entered in '87 and retired in 2014, so it's just over 26 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I wish you the best. Is there any thing you want to say as in closing?
Realistically, I will let America know, and this isn't a scare tactic at all, but our future really is determined a lot on many things, and one of them is our national defense and the threats across the globe. And I know we've been horsing around with some small minor threats, and that's really what they are in the Middle East. But the growing concern of countries that are developing weapons that can destroy us, such as Russia and China, as well as North Korea and Iran, these exist. And, you know, the large countries like Russia and China, you know, people need to be much more aware of future threats that, you know, is affluent and as prosperous as most people are in America. This can very much come to an end if people are, I mean, they're developing hypersonic nuclear weapons, laser energy, drones, cyber attacks. This can all shut our way of life down permanently. And I think a large part of America is uninterested in hearing about this. They really focus on presidential politics alone. And they really need to tune into sources such as yours and others that, you know, tell the whole truth. And sometimes that's not what everybody wants to hear. It doesn't make them feel good, but they need to be aware. They need to stop and get away from this ridiculous identity politics and pitting one group of Americans against another. That is it's petty, it's unuseful, and we're supposed to be the United States and stop. The enemies of America want us to do what the mainstream media is profiting off of it, and that's by dividing us, scaring us, and we really need to come together and stop thinking that America is this, you know, grossly racist country, which that is exactly what our nation's enemies want. We have big problems in America, and we really need to focus on solving them, not just admiring and identifying those problems. So, thank you for what you're doing, Bill.
Oh, and thank you. And your message is great, and I agree 100%. And I'm so glad you were able to articulate it the way you did. So, Fred, thank you so much for being a guest on our show, and really looking forward and hoping to hear from you that you've been reinstated in the Marine Corps as a lieutenant colonel, and I'll happily salute you.
Oh, thank you so much, Bill. Okay. God bless you.
God bless you, and God bless our Corps.
That's right. Semper Fi.